Ethics Untangled is brought to you by IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. To find out more about IDEA, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. Cancelling and cancel culture are terms that we hear a lot these days, and it's one of the many areas where there seems to be more heat than light. The phenomenon of cancelling has become a front in the so-called culture wars, with one side claiming it's a healthy form of protest or simply confronting people with the consequences of their actions, while the other side sees it as persecution by an unaccountable mob. Alfred Archer and Georgie Mills, both philosophers at Tilburg University, have tried to disentangle some of the different actions that sometimes get called cancelling, and to help us better understand the ethics of this complex phenomenon. Alfred Archer and Georgie Mills, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
No problem. So we're going to talk about online cancellation today. So definitely a topic that I think people will be thinking about and will be aware of as a kind of, I suppose, a bit of a bone of contention, really, socially speaking. It's a bit of a kind of culture war issue, isn't it? It's something that people talk about quite a lot and people disagree about and get quite agitated about. Well, we're going to be talking about exactly what it means to cancel somebody online, but we're also going to be talking about the ethics of cancellation. So we're going to be asking kind of when might it be justified to engage in cancelling behaviour, I suppose. So I'd normally start by asking what cancelling is, but actually that's quite a big question as it turns out, and that's going to be one of the things that we'll be spending a lot of time on. So actually I wondered if we might start by saying, where does cancelling come from? What's the origin of the term cancelling? Because that was one of the interesting things that I learned from your paper. So does somebody want to give me an introduction to where cancelling originated?
Sure. So we looked at the work by media scholars and communication scholars who've tried to chart the history of this term. So media scholar Meredith Clark traces the origin of the term to queer communities of colour on Twitter in the United States in the early to mid 2010s. And a different media theorist, Eve Ing, traces the origin of the term cancelling back even further to, first of all, to Chic's 1981 song, Your Love Is Cancelled. And then even further than that, all the way back to the 1948 musical South Pacific, in which there's a song, I'm going to wash that man right out of my hair, which refers to cancelling as kind of breaking off a relationship with someone.
Right. I'm familiar with the South Pacific song, but I wasn't familiar with the Chic song. So I actually went and had a listen to it because, any excuse to listen to Chic, really. But it's kind of interesting. So I think the story there is that Nile Rodgers went on a date with somebody and it went really badly wrong. I think apparently what happened, I was reading this account, he went on a date with this woman and she kind of tried to use his celebrity power to kind of get people cleared out of the restaurant for them so that they could have like a whole area of the restaurant to themselves. So she was kind of throwing his weight around, so to speak, and that really annoyed him. And then he went home and wrote this song, Your Love Is Cancelled, about that. So it was kind of about somebody's bad behaviour leading him to kind of want to end a relationship with them, I suppose. That's kind of, so it's you can see how it sort of relates to what cancelling came to mean later, but it's not quite the same, I suppose.
Yeah, and it relates, I guess, to the how it came to be used in the 2010s when it became popularized to refer to kind of breaking off a relationship with someone or kind of publicly distancing yourself from someone. So it really took off after this 2014 episode of a reality television show, Love and Hip Hop New York,
Right,
which was titled You're Cancelled, where one of the kind of people in this show uses the phrase "you're cancelled" several times in the episode. And then it took off in Black American Twitter shortly after that, in response to that.
Right, great, okay. And you use a particular example in your paper to illustrate the practice of cancelling, and that's the James Somerton story. So I wondered if you could tell us what that story was about.
Yeah. So James Somerton is a Canadian YouTuber who makes a lot of very interesting and and very widely watched YouTube videos about queer media. So he's a sort of video essayist and is well known within the YouTube space as this queer media essayist who's written all these cool videos. And at some point, maybe last year or the year before, I've forgotten exactly how long ago it was, another video essay came out by a British YouTuber, H-Bomber guy. His real name is Harry Brewis, I think, who essentially went through loads of Somerton's videos and found that an overwhelming majority of them were almost word for word plagiarized by either lesser known creators or books that sort of were maybe not read by everybody who's watching James Somerton's videos. So just enormous amounts of Somerton's work had been plagiarized, and with very minor changes, but often it was almost word for word copied. And what was interesting about this example is, of course, Somerton experienced a huge public backlash about this. But there was more than just this public backlash against him. But, well, for me, as somebody who was interested in Somerton's work before and who heard about this, and I'm interested in queer media in general, there was this kind of element to it where the point is not just the sort of social punishment cancellation of James Somerton, but also bringing attention to the fact that there are all these smaller creators whose work he'd used who kind of deserve the reputation of having written what they've written that Somerton was kind of gaining this reputation for. So the mechanics of Somerton's cancellation, it's got this this element to it where, of course, the backlash against Somerton was severe, and we can talk about the ethics of that in a little while. But there was also this kind of redressing of his reputation as somebody who created all of these works. And what H-Bomber Guy did was he, along with his video in which he detailed all of this plagiarism, he created a playlist of lesser known creators who had, some of whom Somerton had plagiarized from, but also some of whom were just good and interesting and worth the attention of people who are interested in the kinds of topics that Somerton covers, but without the worry of all of this plagiarism. So that's what made this such an interesting case. As of now, I don't believe Somerton is still very active on YouTube. He has addressed this backlash a couple of times since, and also interestingly to me, H-Bomber Guy donated all the proceeds of his video on this plagiarism to people who had been plagiarized. So it was kind of this movement of justice for the victims of this plagiarism, as well as, unfortunately, the cancellation of James Somerton.
Okay, good. So the question I suppose we're interested in is, what was H-Bomber Guy doing there? But I guess also all the other people who might have, I suppose, complained about Somerton's output or just stopped engaging with it, right? So insofar as we can think of that as being cancelling that person, what does that mean? And what were those people doing? So we're going to get into different forms of cancelling. But I just wondered, is it possible to give a broad definition of cancelling before we do that?
Yeah, I think very broadly, we can say that cancelling involves social withdrawal from the person, distancing yourself from that person. But it also is a kind of public act. So there must be some kind of announcement or public kind of statement, some kind that you are making that withdrawal. I think when people decide that they no longer want to engage with Somerton's work and then post about this on social media, we can see that as meeting this broad account of what cancelling is. But our main point in the paper, as you've already hinted towards, is that this very broad understanding of cancelling includes a lot of different moral practices within it that should be understood differently.
Yeah. So it is something on that account. It's something that one person can do, right? Because I suppose you might think of cancelling as being a collective act, right? But on that account, it sounds like as long as it's public, as long as the person is not just stopping engaging with the person's work, but publicizing the fact that they're doing that, that counts as cancellation, even if other people don't pick up on that and follow with what they're doing. Is that right?
Yeah, the way we explain it in the paper, it is something that one person could do. But I guess you're right to point out that usually what we talk about in terms of cancelling is not just when one person is doing it, or when it's part of a wider phenomenon.
Yeah, and one motivation for publicising the fact that you're stopping engaging with that person's work is to persuade other people to come with you and do the same thing, right? you're kind of suggesting that other people do it, if not sort of requiring that they do.
Yeah, well, I mean, there might be many different kinds of motivations that people have here. So they might be motivated by a kind of concern for social justice, and they want to try and persuade other people to do the same kind of thing as them. They might also be motivated by less worthy motivations. They might be motivated by a desire to kind of show off how self-righteous and morally virtuous they are in comparison to other people, or to engage in a form of moralistic scolding, which might not reflect so well in them either. So there are a variety of different motivations that might underline this behavior, and all of them are interesting and worthy of consideration. But what we want to do is really focus on the different kinds of moral practices involved rather than these underlying motivations.
Yes, okay, that makes sense. I did want to kind of ask about public shaming as well, though, because that's a kind of related concept, I suppose. So there's a book that I very much enjoyed by John Ronson called So You've Been Publicly Shamed. I don't know whether you guys read that as well. The cases that he was describing in that book seemed like they were cancelling or sort of cancelling adjacent, but he was focused on the act of kind of shaming the person and the effects of that on the individuals who'd been cancelled. But do you think cancelling inevitably includes an element of public shaming, or do you think that's a kind of contingent relationship? It's only sometimes true that you're shaming the individual by cancelling them.
I think it's in the nature of the fact that some of these things happen on the internet, which is so vast and anyone has access to it, that I don't want to say it's a necessary part of cancellation that there's an element of public shaming, but I do think that it's an inevitable part of it, because a lot of people want to participate in that element of it, regardless of what has kind of started the cancellation situation in the first place. So, for example, with our James Summerton example that we use in the paper, the person who kind of cancelled James Summerton in the first place specifically said, don't go and shame him, don't go and harass him. And yet, of course people did, because it's the internet, and this is something that is incredibly widespread there. And this makes the ethics of it quite complicated, because I think I heard somebody describe it as like the snowflake never feels responsible for the problems that the avalanche causes. But of course, when you have communication on this extremely large scale, the behavior of each individual who might participate in this cancelling is not something that you can easily predict or control if you're somebody who's speaking out about something that might lead to a cancellation of someone. Yeah,
something that I remember people being accused of online, not so much recently, but certainly a few years ago, is orchestrating a pile-on, right? So one person would criticize another person, and if the person doing the criticizing has a very large number of followers, the inevitable result of that is that they all pile on that person as well. And the person who initiated that might say, look, that wasn't my intention. I'm just a person criticizing another person, right? But then people would say, yeah, but you must have known what would happen, right? And you have a kind of responsibility when you have that amount of online clout to think about what's going to happen as a result of your individual actions.
I'd just like to say, so I mean, I fully agree with what Georgie said, but I think it's also, we've put the publicity part as part of what cancelling is. So that makes some kind of public thing a necessary component of it. But I think it would be possible to try and think about ways in which this public accountability might be aimed more at blaming someone for their actions rather than shaming them as a kind of whole person, targeting them as a kind of despicable moral agent who's completely irredeemable, and all the other things that perhaps might end up featuring as part of how we understand shame rather than blame.
Yeah, that's a good distinction to make, isn't it? Because, again, I think I can think of examples of where somebody's been accused of kind of shaming somebody, but their defense is, well, no, I'm just kind of I'm holding that person accountable, right? I'm kind of bringing them face to face with the sort of consequences of their actions, right? So it's more kind of action focused rather than person focused, and at least by their lights, like less to do with shame and more to do with blame. So yeah, that's a useful point to make. Okay, so one of the writers that you engage with in your work is someone called Radzik, and their account is that cancelling is a form of punishment and that it's rarely justified as such. So could you tell me why they think that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Linda Radzik's, I think, really the philosopher who's written most about cancelling, and her work is really excellent.
Right.
But she understands cancelling as a form of social punishment. It's a way of holding someone responsible by making them suffer as a result of the wrongdoing that they've done. And so punishment is, of course, something that's a widespread moral practice in our society. I mean, putting people in jail, fining people, making them serve community service orders, all forms of punishment, ways in which we try and hold people morally accountable. But Radzik's particularly interested in how cancelling functions as a form of social punishment, and particularly worried about this because she thinks here we have a form of punishment that doesn't go through the normal kind of procedures that more formal forms of punishment would go through. There's no jury that would hear a case as to whether someone's innocent or guilty. There's often not much of a presumption of innocence, as she thinks. People tend to be quite quick to assume that someone is guilty. So in general, she thinks for punishment to be justified, a wrongdoer has to deserve the punishment, and the people doing the punishment have to know that, so they have to be in a good position to judge that the wrongdoer deserves the punishment. And kind of inflicting this suffering of punishment on the wrongdoer has to have some kind of good consequences, better consequences than other ways we might go about addressing this issue. And Radzik thinks that basically when it comes to social punishment, when it comes to cancelling, these conditions are very rarely going to be met. It may be the case that the wrongdoer deserves the punishment, but the people online doing the cancelling are often not going to be in a good position to know whether the wrongdoer deserves the punishment. It also may be the case that the wrongdoer deserves some kind of punishment, but the problem with cancelling online is that it's very hard to keep the punishment within the right kind of limits. Maybe they deserve some criticism from what they've done, but do they really deserve millions and millions of people joining it to publicly criticize them? I mean, this is something that came up in the John Hunson book. He gave examples of people who have done things that are worthy of criticism, but then the nature of the criticism, or the kind of the size of the criticism, seemed to completely escape the bounds of what would be a kind of appropriate level of criticism, both in its intensity and just in the number of people. Given these problems, that we just shouldn't really engage in cancelling, or at least it's rarely going to be justified.
Yeah, I suppose that the scale is really that it's just very difficult to predict what the scale of the punishment is going to be, right? So you can't possibly know whether it's going to be proportionate because you've got no idea how many people are going to join in, or, you know, what form the kind of, you know, cancelling is going to take ultimately, because it might not just be people unfollowing them on Twitter or X or whatever. It might be people sending them abuse and all that kind of stuff. So it can very quickly kind of balloon and become disproportionate.
Yeah, or people sending messages to their employers, getting them back for their jobs, that kind of thing as well. Yeah.
But I wondered also, thinking about punishment and the justification of punishment. So I think that point about whether the people doing the punishing are in a position to know that the person deserves the punishment, right? So that's a really important point. But I wonder if that captures everything about why we might criticize that kind of practice. Because it seems to me, if you think about some of the other forms of punishment that you mentioned, like sending people to prison or giving them community service or whatever, so those are things which are kind of thought of as properly functions of the state, right? So there's a kind of, and I suppose that maybe one reason why we think that they're more justified is because there's some elements of democratic accountability there as well, right? So there's a kind of recourse by which people can kind of complain if there's been injustice. There's appeals processes and things like that. And so it seems to me like, if you think about those kinds of punishment, like, we don't think that if somebody set up a really, really good court in their house, they would then be justified in kind of holding somebody prisoner, right? And it wouldn't matter whether they were really, really assiduous in ensuring that the evidential standard had been met. The point is, it's not their place to do that, right? It's, you know, it's something that we say is, properly a function of the state, and something that kind of individual citizens shouldn't be able to do. And kind of carrying that across to the cancelling sort of case, it is part of the criticism as well. It's not just that these people aren't necessarily in a good position to know that the person deserves the punishment, but also it's not just that, it's just not their place to inflict that punishment themselves, right? Because it can be quite severe punishment, and it's not something that we think that individual citizens should be able to do.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think, maybe they lack the appropriate authority for the level of punishment that can be inflicted. I would say, though, that it's not like this is entirely new. I mean, I guess that practices of social punishment would predate practices of state punishment, where
Right.
in whatever community people feel that they want to shun a particular person because as a response to their wrongdoing, or kind of not engage with them, not give them, or kind of look down on them in some way. I think the social punishment in general is not anything new, but what is new is the scale of it and the way in which this can quite quickly become the defining feature of someone to all kinds of people across the world who otherwise would never have heard of the person. And so I think that the scale that the online world allows for this kind of punishment does perhaps mean that you need a bit more authority and a bit more justification to engage in it.
If I could just add to that, there is also an element to some instances of online cancelling where part of the reason for the online cancellation is that people feel that the formal systems of justice have failed them. So, for example, I don't believe that Brock Turner would be a household name if it weren't for the fact that his prison sentence as a convicted rapist was so very lenient. I think the fact that a lot of people reacted to his case as a case where the state had kind of decided that because he was a swimmer and because he was a bright young man, that he ought not to be punished for a completely kind of open and shut case where he was convicted as a rapist. You know, he was caught in the act and he was found guilty, but his punishment seemed quite extremely lenient. And I think the fact that now everybody, well, not everybody, but a large number of people globally know his name and have kind of participated in the business of being outraged by his punishment is because they see this as a failure of formal systems of justice.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I mean, there was definitely a political element to that kind of online activity, right, around that case. It's not just that people wanted to ensure that that person, you know, suffered what they deserved to suffer. It was also, the point was being made that the wider kind of structures of justice had failed in that instance. And there was a kind of element of protest to it as well, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, great. But you think that cancelling isn't always a form of punishment, right? So, and one of the things that you say that it can be rather than punishment is reputation correction. So can you say a bit about what you mean by that, please?
We think cancelling often should be understood, sometimes at least, as an attempt to correct an unjustified reputation. So in the Somerton case, where he's plagiarized work of lesser known authors or YouTubers, we think that the kind of public statement of distancing yourself from this person and kind of saying why people shouldn't engage with his work so much isn't really aimed at making him suffer, at least not primarily. It's more aimed at kind of correcting an unjustified and overly inflated reputation that Somerton possessed, and make it more accurate so that we no longer think of him as someone who's come up with all these excellent ideas. Instead, we attribute those ideas to the correct sources. But I don't think the aim of this publicity should be understood as suffering. Certainly in the case of the H-Bomber guy, he was very clear, as Georgie already mentioned. He didn't want people to harass Somerton. He didn't want people to engage in any online shaming. He just wanted to make it clear that actually he wasn't creating this work and other people were creating this work. And so I think we can say here that the conditions under which this would be appropriate are a little bit different from that of punishment. We don't have to justify inflicting suffering on Somerton. What we have to justify is that he really deserves to have a lower reputation than he does at the moment. That the reputation he possessed was unjustified. So the key kind of ethical condition that needs to be met then is that is it the case that someone has an unjustifiably inflated reputation, and do they deserve to have that corrected?
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. But I suppose, like, inevitably that's going to involve some suffering, right? He's kind of been enjoying this really inflated reputation, and that is then going to be taken away from him. So he's going to suffer to that extent. But I suppose the point is, well, what is the point? Is it that kind of inevitably that degree of suffering is going to be merited because he had that reputation fraudulently, and therefore it being taken away from him is it doesn't need further justification.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can compare this to other cases of plagiarism that certainly we as academics might be more familiar with, which is a student plagiarizing their essay. I think there's different responses universities have to plagiarizing an essay. One is to simply say, okay, well, you get a 0 on the essay because you didn't write it, so it'd be unfair to give you credit for someone else's work or for the work of ChatGPT, perhaps. In this case, I don't think we should see this as a punishment. You're simply saying, that the essay or the grade for your essay is a reflection of, what you've put into it, or what you've produced and submitted. And so if you didn't produce it, then, the grade you should get for your essay is 0. And it's not about inflicting suffering. It's just about giving the grade that is merited for the submission. But there might be further sanctions that come in as well. So you might also, put it on their permanent academic record that they've engaged in plagiarism. They might be thrown out of their degree program altogether. And I think those further actions should be seen as a form of punishment. And we have to think about whether or not those forms of punishment are deserved. But the simple case of not giving someone credit for work that wasn't theirs, I think shouldn't be seen as a form of punishment. And I think that's the case with James Somerton as well. The initial aim to just correct the reputation that was unjustified wasn't primarily about inflicting suffering, whether that was deserved or not. It was aiming at correcting people's understanding of what this person had produced and what they hadn't produced.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. So another form that you think cancelling can take, or way in which you think cancelling should sometimes be understood, is as the ending of a parasocial relationship. So what's a parasocial relationship, first of all?
Yeah, a parasocial relationship. Well, I don't have a good definition off the top of my head. I'm sure the person who coined that term has a good definition, but a parasocial relationship might be the relationship that you have with somebody who you don't actually know that mimics a social relationship. So, for example, when I went to see Taylor Swift in the summer and she popped up on stage, I felt a feeling inside my body that was like, oh, it's my friend Taylor, who I've been following forever. Hi, Taylor, I'm over here. Obviously, she doesn't know who I am. And I was among 70,000 people probably all experiencing a similar feeling. So that I experienced as a paradigm example of me having a parasocial relationship. I feel like I know a person, but I don't actually have any social relationship with that person that is an interaction between the two of us. So I hope that example is illustrative of what a parasocial relationship might be.
Yeah, I think we kind of all recognize those kinds of relationships. I can think of various sort of podcast hosts that I have similar kind of relationships where if I saw them in real life, it would be weird because I'd feel as if I know them quite well, but they don't know who I am.
Exactly. And the presence of the internet becoming this platform for so many people to have a direct access to their audience and to share so much of their lives and to kind of have followers who follow them as a person as well as just buy into whatever it is they're creating. It really creates a breeding ground for all kinds of parasocial relationships.
Yeah. And okay, so if cancelling is just ending a parasocial relationship, it just means, just stopping engaging with some person in that kind of way. But of course, the way you've defined it, also publicizing the fact that you're doing that, right?
Yeah. Very often what will happen that will constitute somebody's cancellation is just large scale disengagement from the parasocial relationship. And of course, nobody is obliged to engage in a parasocial relationship. Nobody is obliged to engage in any kind of social relationship if they don't want to. So it seems like there's nothing ethically wrong with disengaging with a parasocial relationship that you no longer want to continue because you found out about somebody's behavior that you don't endorse, or you found out that they didn't write something they said they did, or you found some reason for them being cancelled. But on the part of the person who is experiencing this mass disengagement of the people who have a parasocial relationship with them, who they maybe depend on for income, it may well feel very punishing. It may well feel like a coordinated attack on them. But the reality of the ethics of it is that no one person is obliged to continue a parasocial relationship for any reason.
Yeah. It's very weird, isn't it, this, when you kind of start to think about what that kind of cancelling must feel like to the person who's being cancelled, right? So, I don't know, well, hesitate to bring up this example, but if you're J.K. Rowling, right, for example, you've got kind of millions of people who've had parasocial relationships with you, but obviously those relationships are very one-sided, right? So you don't know these people individually. They've engaged with your work, and then they've kind of, because of things that you said, decided that they're no longer going to engage with your work, and they're also going to tell everybody that they're doing that. It must sort of feel like, I mean, it is somebody ending a relationship with you. It's not somebody that you know, but it must kind of engage some of the emotions that you would feel if somebody you actually did know decided that they were going to cut off all contact with you in some ways, right? It must slightly feel like a sort of betrayal or something like that. But it's very difficult to kind of work out how we should think about those kinds of relationships and the sort of effects of ending them and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure it does feel like that. And especially, I think parasocial relationships can kind of go both ways in some sense. Like public figures, they have an awareness of their audience and a relationship to them that is also kind of isolated in themselves because it's not this direct connection. And so it must feel like a little bit like being betrayed by your community when they all turn against you en masse. But I think that J.K. Rowling is a good example for this because I'm a millennial woman who was slightly nerdy in high school. I'm very much her target audience. And yeah, I have stopped engaging with her work because of her behavior, but never tweeted towards her, never said hate towards her. The idea was not to punish her. I don't really think about that. It's really tainted my desire to engage with her work again.
Yes. Yeah. It's true, isn't it? And it's kind of, it does seem like a very modern phenomenon as well, because like in the pre-internet age, I think you wouldn't have thought about stopping reading somebody's work as ending a relationship with them, right? They would have just been a writer, and you might have stopped reading their books if they did something really egregious, because you wouldn't have been able to read the books without thinking about what they'd done or so on. But there is something more to that relationship in the sort of internet age where you're more engaged with their kind of statements on a day-to-day basis, and sort of there's a bit more reciprocation going on there that makes it a slightly more kind of rich relationship, and then more of a break when it's ended, I suppose. I'm a bit older than you, basically, so I kind of Harry Potter was like, I've read them, but I was probably too old to be reading them, so I don't kind of have quite that sort of connection to them that sounds like you do.
Could I just add something on that last point?
Yeah, go on. Yeah.
So I think you're right that it is definitely much more of a phenomenon now, but it is interesting that the term was coined originally in 1956 to refer to the relationship that people have. The main example was people would have to TV presenters or radio presenters, where they relate to these presenters as if they're like a friend or family member. I think with the internet you get a much more pervasive kind of there's much more content for people to consume, I guess, about their celebrity. But also perhaps it's not, maybe it was something particular to presenters who are on your TV every day, on the radio every day, and an author or a musician, they might be interviewed sometimes, but mostly you're consuming with their artistic creations rather than them as a person. Yeah. But now, of course, those musicians, those authors have Twitter or X accounts or other forms of social media. And so it's not just the products you're engaging with, it's also their lives as a whole that you're engaging with. Which of course was the case before, but is much more so the case now, I think. Yeah. And so I think just the number of people's lives who are available for this kind of parasocial interaction has drastically increased. And the amount of content we get about their lives has increased as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay. And then there's another form of cancelling that you highlight, which is the ending of an instance of informal political representation. This draws on the work of Wendy Salkin, right? And Wendy Salkin's a former interviewee on this podcast, so people might want to go back and listen to the episode that we did on informal political representation. But can you give a kind of short précis of what that means and how that relates to cancelling?
Yeah, it's great to hear that Wendy Salkin was on this podcast, because we were really inspired by her work for this part of the paper. So basically, celebrities often act as informal representatives for groups or for causes. That means that they're people who speak for a particular group of people or a particular cause without being in a position of formal representation. So they haven't been elected as a spokesperson or a leader of a particular movement, but still they are taken by their audience to be speaking for a particular group. Think of in the UK, Joanna Lumley speaking for the Gurkha Justice Campaign, or Marcus Rashford speaking on behalf of poor families and people experiencing food poverty. So in both these cases, they're speaking on behalf of a group in the political arena and making kind of a political case on behalf of that group. And one of the things that Salkin focuses on in her book is the fact that they're kind of bestowed this quality by their audience. The audience is taking them to be representative of the group, to be to be speaking with authority on behalf of the group. I think often what is going on in cancelling, where people are distancing themselves from someone and making public statements that distance themselves from someone, is that members of the group being represented are trying to say to the public, look, you shouldn't take this person as a representative for our group. This person doesn't speak for us. We don't want them to be seen as a representative of the group. So, yeah, one example we give in the paper is the case of the talk show host Ellen DeGeneres, who was seen by many people as a kind of informal representative of LGBTQ people in the United States. And when initially she got kind of cancelled to a small extent by people who had seen her kind of publicly being friends and having friendly conversations with George W. Bush. And some members of the LGBTQ community thought, this isn't something that an informal representative for this community should be doing, given what was, in their view, his terrible record as president in relation to LGBTQ rights. And so what I think sometimes is going on with cancelling is that people are ending this relationship of informal representation. They're saying to the public, don't take this person to be a spokesperson for us, and trying to persuade people that, this isn't someone who speaks for us. And the ethical considerations here are not about whether this person deserves to suffer, or really that much to do with the deservingness of any kind of punishment, but really about whether that person is operating as an effective representative for the group and is a democratic representative of the group, someone who takes the interests of the group seriously and kind of effectively gives voice to what people in the group are thinking.
Yeah, so it's a bit like the reputation correction point, but it's slightly different in that you're saying it's not just that they have a reputation that they don't deserve, it's that they're occupying a role which they ought really not to be occupying, and it's that you're trying to correct by cancelling them in that way.
Yeah, and so the ethical considerations we should consider here are the ones that Salkin talks about in her book, and presumably in the earlier podcast, which is about whether they're being an effective and democratic representative.
Yes. Is it also partly, again, that point about kind of whose place it is or who's in the right kind of standing to engage in these kinds of forms of cancellation? That seems relevant again there, right? So it might not just be whether that person actually should be in that role, but the people who are trying to remove them from that role, is it really their place to be doing that, right? And I suppose one question is kind of, are they themselves part of the group that person is seeking to represent? Because if they're not, then you might kind of say, well, it's not really any of your business who represents their interests, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think this opens up a really interesting question about who's the authority, the standing to engage in this kind of cancellation. Yeah, I think you pointed to one kind of source of authority you might have in this situation where, are you a member of this group? Which might give you some kind of authority to speak on behalf of the group to say, we don't want this person to be taken as a representative of us. But even if you're a member of the group, it still might be tricky to say that, you're really in a place to speak for all of the group. And groups do not tend to be uniform in their opinion. Some people in the group might still want this person to be an informal representative, and some people might not. So when someone has the authority to make this kind of pronouncement, it's, I think, a very interesting issue.
Great. Okay. So you've pointed to 3, I think, additional ways in which we might understand cancelling. So as well as punishment, it might be reputation correction, it might be the ending of a parasocial relationship, and it might be the ending of or the seeking to end somebody's position as an informal political representative. And it seems like there are going to be slightly different ethical criteria in each case that we should apply to that. So the justification for engaging in each form of cancelling might be somewhat different. But just one more question, which is, and it's something we kind of touched on earlier, I suppose, but kind of how cleanly can we separate these forms of cancellation from each other? Because it seems likely that if you're engaging in an act of cancelling with one kind of intention, right, to correct somebody's reputation, say, inevitably the result of that is going to be that lots of other people, well, not inevitably, but very often what's going to happen is lots of other people will join in, and they might have other kinds of motivation and might have other kinds of effects. And so should we say that somebody's responsible for the particular kind of cancelling that they are engaged in, or that they're intending to be engaged in? Or might they also be responsible for the broader effects of doing that in bringing other people in who might have different motivations and intentions? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think this is an incredibly hard question, because I think that any one of these forms of cancelling is inevitably going to come hand in hand with some punishment. And, in the age where many millions of people can engage in that, if it's happening online, in many cases, this is going to be completely disproportionate, and there's really no way of handling it that's going to make it proportionate. So I think this is a big problem. But if you look at what else is at stake in these cases, with the Somerton case, well, what happens if we say there's no way to bring about this reputation correction without also inviting harassment? So too bad, so sad for all the people whose work was stolen. I guess we'll do nothing. Like, that seems like it's also not an ideal solution. I suppose in that case, if YouTube had better mechanics for detecting and addressing plagiarism as academia does, then perhaps this wouldn't be as big of a problem. But you're certainly never going to cover all the kinds of problems that cancelling tends to latch onto in this way. There's never going to be formal processes to address all the things that people become cancelled over that are going to keep responses proportionate. So I think that the only thing we can do is invite people to be mindful if they're doing any kind of participation in online harassment. What are you doing here? Are you cancelling someone because you're actually, or you participating in someone's cancelling because you actually think that you're doing something morally good by participating in this? Are you informally ending a representation? And if so, do you need to participate in that in a way that is directed at the person that might be harmful? If you're ending a parasocial relationship, do you even need to tell anybody about that? I think this might be one way of addressing it, but of course, there's really no kind of way to control how other people are going to behave in a global mass online space. So asking to consider what the ethical ramifications of any one instance of cancelling might be is very difficult. For a lot of people, the most salient cases of cancelling for people who don't spend too much time online might be cases like Harvey Weinstein and other cases of long-standing sexual abuse that's been swept under the rug for decades. And it's really hard to say, well, any response to that is not proportionate. I don't know that I can give a satisfying answer to your question of how we should ethically evaluate participating in these cases. There are also cases that are extremely trivial that, as we sort of speak about in the first part of the paper that there might be motivations to cancel someone that are more to do with moral grandstanding than anything else, or that are more to do with, taking a bit of glee and taking someone down a peg that you don't like, rather than actually caring about the reason they're being cancelled. That certainly happens, and it's hard to ethically justify that kind of behavior, but it's also hard to provide any kind of guidelines for how to handle cancelling behavior when the effects of it so much possess the potential to outweigh the intentions of them because of the global scale on which this is happening.
I suppose that's one thing that we can say then is actually like engaging in a form of behavior that might seem fairly straightforward when you're doing it actually turns out to be very complex, and actually it's much the challenge of ensuring that you're justified in doing that might be much greater than you think it is. So be careful.
Yeah,
if I could just add something to that, I think, maybe this is a bit overly ambitious, but one thing our paper could do to the world is persuade people that, we shouldn't see all of these things as just one phenomenon. There is a need to distinguish between whether what you're doing is ending an informal representation relationship, ending a power social relationship, punishing someone, or correcting a reputation. And so the fact that someone may be justified in ending an informal representative relationship doesn't mean that they're justified in inflicting shame and suffering on the person who they're ending the relationship with. So our hope is that in some small way, that kind of letting people or bringing to people's attention the idea that these are different kinds of things that are going on might also help people realize that, the fact that you're cancelling in one way doesn't mean you're justified in cancelling in another way.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. Great. Well, that's all we've got time for. So let me just say, Georgie Mills and Alfred Archer, thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for listening to Ethics Untangled, a podcast from IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. IDEA brings ethics to life, blending in-depth theoretical inquiry with real-world experience to address the most complex ethical issues facing the world today. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And to find out more about IDEA, including our Masters and PhD programmes and a wide range of consultancy services we offer, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.